What if I told you that the greatest clash between two civilizations was decided not on the battlefield, but within the cold stone confines of a single city? The city of Cajamarca became the stage where 168 people prepared to meet the dawn that would mark their end. In the valley before them lay a camp of 80,000 warriors of the Inca Empire.
There was nowhere to retreat, and moving forward seemed madness.
Imagine that night. Just a few hundred Spaniards sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the enemy camp drifting up from the valley. They knew that for every one of them, there were 400 or even 500 enemies, and the realization of inevitable doom hung in the air. In today's video, we'll take a detailed look at exactly what psychological and tactical tricks the conquistadors used to turn the tide of events that seemed utterly hopeless. Be sure to watch this video all the way to the end to find out
how one sleepless night and precise calculations broke the backbone of South America's most powerful empire.
Like this video right now if you love epic historical mysteries, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you don't miss our new exciting investigations. Get comfortable, pour yourself some tea, and let's dive into this incredible story together. A secret passed down from generation to generation holds that the city's architecture determined the outcome of that day. The Spanish entered the empty Cajamarca and immediately recognized its central square as the perfect mechanism for isolation. The triangular shape of the main square had only a few narrow exits surrounded by long stone buildings. These structures, with their thick walls and few doorways, became natural hiding places for an ambush. Pizarro's force didn't just occupy the city, it turned it into a giant trap. Each building was carefully inspected and assigned to different groups of soldiers. The infantry took up positions in the arcades, hiding in the deep shadows of the doorways. The stone walls reliably concealed any movement and muffled the clang of metal armor. The commanders had measured the distances from the doors to the center of the square in advance to calculate the throwing time.
The entire city became a single tactical scheme, where every person knew their place.
The windows and ventilation openings in the building served as ideal embrasures for the archers. Inside the buildings, there was absolute darkness, making the people inside invisible to those outside. The Spaniards draped some passageways with thick fabrics to eliminate accidental glints of light from their armor. The square remained empty and inviting, creating the illusion of absolute safety for those entering. This emptiness was the main lure in their plan. Pizarro's strategy relied on using an enclosed space against overwhelming numerical superiority. In open terrain, the massive Inca army would simply have swallowed up the small detachment in a matter of minutes. Inside the stone walls, the front narrowed to a few meters, depriving the enemy of maneuverability. The crowd in the plaza would become immobile and unable to use its main advantage. The stone of Cajamarca worked better for the Spaniards than their own steel. To enhance the trap's effect, some passages were deliberately barricaded with heavy beams. This was intended to direct the flow of incoming people into strictly defined sectors of the plaza. An artificial corridor was created that led straight into the center of a pre-prepared kill zone. Soldiers methodically checked the strength of the barricades to ensure they would not collapse at a critical moment. Every stone and every beam became a silent participant in the impending clash. The rooftops also played a strategic role in this deployment. Light artillery was hoisted up there, and the squad's most accurate arquebusiers were stationed there. The height provided an excellent view of the entire valley and allowed them to control the approaches to the city. Lookouts on the rooftops were to signal the approach of the empire's ruler. Their task was to constantly monitor the situation without making a sound. Inside the
secure the
spacious
perimeter
halls
before
where the
moonset.
local nobility once gathered, intense preparations were now underway. Soldiers checked their belts, tightened their buckles, and polished their weapons in complete darkness. Each of them understood that the outcome of the coming morning depended on the sturdiness of their equipment. Their movements were sparse and practiced to the point of automatism so as not to make any unnecessary noise. Metal rubbed quietly against metal, creating a barely perceptible hum within the stone walls. Pizarro personally inspected every building, checking his men's positions and issuing final instructions. His voice was quiet but firm, instilling confidence in the men exhausted by the long march. He reminded them of strict discipline and forbade them from leaving their cover until a special signal was given. No one was allowed to reveal themselves prematurely, even if the emperor himself appeared in the square. The plan required perfect synchronization of all the scattered groups. As midnight approached, the city was plunged into an eerie silence, broken only by whispers. People sat on the stone floors, hugging their knees, and peered into the darkness of the doorways. The cold mountain air seeped into the rooms, forcing the soldiers to wrap themselves more tightly in their cloaks. They did not light fires so that smoke and light would not betray their presence in the buildings.
Darkness became their chief ally and a reliable shelter until dawn.
The architecture of Cajamarca proved to be the perfect tool for carrying out the most daring plan in history. The stone walls became fortress walls, and the empty square an arena for the decisive maneuver. The Spaniards used a foreign city as their own weapon against its creators. This calculation, based on the geometry of the space, largely determined the outcome of the entire confrontation. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about this use of architecture? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what was going on in the soldiers' minds during those long hours? When preparations were complete, the time came for agonizing anticipation in the icy silence of the mountains. The temperature in the Andes plummeted at night, and the cold penetrated people to their very bones. The metal armor cooled, turning into an icy shell that was impossible to remove. Every minute of waiting felt like an hour, and the silence weighed on their minds more heavily than the noise of battle. The soldiers exchanged brief glances in the twilight, seeking support from one another. Many of them were seasoned veterans of European campaigns, but now they found themselves in a completely unfamiliar world. The realization of the enemy's numerical superiority weighed heavily on their shoulders. They knew that in the morning, either an incredible triumph or complete oblivion awaited them in these mountains. The lack of a retreat route made their resolve absolute, but it did not relieve them of their fear. In the darkness, all their senses were heightened, and the slightest rustle made the men flinch. The sound of a falling stone or the creak of a leather strap seemed like deafening thunder in the stone halls. The soldiers tried to breathe evenly and quietly so as not to disturb the fragile silence of their shelter. They listened to the wind sweeping across the empty square, trying to catch the sounds of the approaching army in it.
It was a test of nerves that not everyone could withstand.
The commanders had forbidden any conversation to prevent panic from spreading among the rank-and-file soldiers. Only occasionally were brief commands heard, passed along the line in whispers from one man to another. In this silence, everyone was left alone with their thoughts and fears about the day ahead. They recalled the journey they had taken, the ships left behind, and the promises of incredible riches. Motivation mingled with the instinct for self-preservation, creating a complex emotional backdrop within the unit. Many spent these hours in silent contemplation, fingering wooden prayer beads. Religion was a powerful anchor that kept them from despair during the critical moments of the expedition. They believed they were carrying out a great mission, and this belief gave them additional strength. Spiritual support helped them cope with the mounting psychological pressure and uncertainty. An inner conviction that they were doing the right thing made their ranks monolithic even in the invisible darkness. Physical exhaustion also made itself felt after the grueling trek through the mountains, but the tension was so great that even the most exhausted fighters could not sleep. Adrenaline circulated in their blood, causing their muscles to contract reflexively in anticipation of a command. The men sat in uncomfortable positions, afraid to move or make a single sound. It was a night of maximum alertness when the body was working at the limit of its capabilities. In the distance, beyond the city limits, thousands of lights from the enemy camp could be seen covering the hillsides. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying, revealing the true scale of the threat. The lights resembled a scattering of stars on the ground, and their number seemed endless.
The Spaniards gazed at this sea of fires through narrow embrasures, assessing the density of the enemy ranks.
Visual confirmation of the enemy's strength only intensified each soldier's inner focus. Pizarro understood the state of his men and tried to stay close to the most vulnerable sections. His calmness and confidence rubbed off on the others, easing the general tension. He did not deliver fiery speeches. His presence spoke for itself. The expedition leader shared the cold, the darkness, and the risk of the impending clash with his soldiers. This created a strong bond between the commander and his men, essential for the flawless execution of the plan. With every passing hour, the air grew colder, and the sky above the mountains remained pitch black. Time dragged on, turning the night into an endless test of endurance and discipline. The men checked the mechanisms of their arquebuses, making sure the dampness hadn't damaged the gunpowder on the shelves. Preparing their weapons was the only activity that allowed them to distract themselves from their oppressive thoughts. In these simple mechanical movements, they found a kind of solace. Dawn was approaching inexorably, promising to bring an end to this protracted wait. The night before, Cajamarca became a crucible in which the squad's iron discipline was forged. They had entered these buildings as ordinary people, but by morning they had become a single, finely tuned mechanism. The psychological transformation was complete, and now all that remained was to wait for the signal to act. Could you have maintained the same composure while staring at the endless sea of enemy lights? What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries, for it is the secret of perfect coordination. On rooftops and in narrow passageways, the Spaniards were secretly deploying their primary technological advantage. Falconets, light artillery pieces, were carefully hoisted up narrow stone staircases in complete silence. The gun crews proceeded with the utmost caution so that the metal would not strike the stone. These guns were intended to deliver the initial shock and break up the dense formation in the square. Artillery positions were chosen to maximize the angle of fire on the central area. The guns were aimed at the sections where the greatest concentration of the ruler's entourage was expected. The artillerymen had preset the barrels to eliminate the need for aiming during the attack. Everything was calculated down to the centimeter to ensure maximum effectiveness of the first volley. The steel muzzles stared motionless into the darkness, awaiting their moment. The guns were loaded under the strictest safety precautions due to the darkness. The gunpowder was carefully measured and poured into the breech, then tightly packed with a wad. Heavy lead cannonballs or grape shot were placed on top to engage dense crowds of people. Every movement of the artillerymen had been perfected through months of training on ships.
They worked in the dark, relying solely on muscle memory and tactile sensations.
Next to the falconets were the positions of the musketeers, armed with heavy arquebuses. These weapons required complex handling of fuses, gunpowder, and lead bullets. The gunners carefully cleaned the priming mechanisms and checked the reliability of their guns' firing mechanisms. In high humidity conditions, keeping the gunpowder dry was a top priority for every arquebusier. They hid their powder flasks under their cloaks, protecting them from the cold mountain mist. One of the main problems was the use of smoldering fuses for firing arquebuses. In complete darkness, the red glows of the fuses could easily give away the positions of ambushes on the rooftops. To conceal the light, soldiers placed the smoldering ends into special metal tubes with holes. This allowed the wicks to burn without giving away the shooters' positions until the very last moment. Technical ingenuity helped solve the problems arising from the nature of a nighttime ambush. The shooters were distributed across sectors to create crossfire over the entire area. Each group knew its zone of responsibility and was to fire only at a specific square. This distribution ensured that no safe areas would remain in the square once the attack began. The intensity of the impending fire was calculated to completely paralyze the column's movement. The architecture of the buildings was ideal for creating such a multi-level fire network. Tension among the artillerymen was mounting, as their salvo was to serve as the main signal. A single person's mistake could lead to a premature shot and the failure of the entire plan. Therefore, an experienced officer stood near each gun, supervising the crew's actions. They checked the readiness of the ignition tubes and the availability of sufficient ammunition. Communication within the crews took place through light touches and pre-arranged gestures. Heavy crossbows were also cocked and ready for immediate use from the windows of the buildings. The crossbowmen had loaded thick bolts onto the rails, securing the mechanisms in the firing position. These weapons were silent until the moment of firing and possessed tremendous penetrating power. Their task was to target key figures in the ruler's procession. The combination of gunpowder weapons and mechanical crossbows created a versatile system of destruction. By midnight, the unit's entire firepower was concentrated and brought to full readiness.
The buildings of Cajamarca had been transformed into hidden firing positions, ready to unleash a hail of lead and steel.
Pizarro personally inspected the firing sectors, ensuring there were no blind spots in the square. The fire plan was flawless and took into account all the features of the enclosed space. Technical superiority was neatly packed within the stone walls, awaiting dawn. The positioning of the artillery and riflemen completed the formation of a tactical trap around the square. Bulky mechanisms and complex gunpowder technologies were integrated into the city's ancient architecture. The wait for the first shot became the ultimate test for the men operating these mechanisms. They understood that not only the success of the ambush, but also their own lives depended on their accuracy. If you enjoy this detailed analysis of historical tactics, please like this video. The secret that people pay thousands for lies in the use of unexpected elements on the battlefield. In deep courtyards hidden behind the main buildings, the Spaniards positioned their most important tactical reserve. The cavalry, consisting of several dozen horsemen, was divided into 3 strike groups. The horses were the main shock factor, as the Incas had never seen these massive animals before. Deploying the cavalry required special precautions to avoid making noise. The horses, sensing the tension among the men, often became restless in the confined spaces of the courtyards. To prevent them from neighing, the cavalrymen remained constantly by their animals' sides, calming them with gentle strokes. Special thick hoods were placed over the muzzles of some horses to muffle any sounds. The riders did not stray a step from their steeds, maintaining constant physical contact. It was hard work, requiring immense patience and an understanding of the animal's habits. A particular problem was the clatter of horseshoes on the stone slabs of Cajamarca's courtyards. To ensure the cavalry could enter the square completely silently, the horses' hooves were tightly wrapped in pieces of cloth. This trick allowed the heavy war horses to move across the stone softly, as if they were stealthy cats. The cloth was secured with sturdy leather straps to prevent it from coming loose during sudden acceleration. Thanks to this solution, the element of surprise in the cavalry charge was maintained until the very last second. Each group of horsemen had clearly designated gates for entering the square. The area in front of the gates was cleared of any debris that might hinder a gallop. Group commanders Hernando Pizarro and Hernando de Soto had studied their routes in advance. Their task was to split the dense crowd in the square into several isolated sections. The mass and speed of the armored horses were intended to accomplish what the infantry could not. The riders checked the fastenings of their saddles and girths, ensuring they were perfectly tightened. The metal parts of the tack were wrapped in rags to prevent any accidental clinking as they moved. The cavalrymen sat on the ground next to their stirrups, ready to leap into the saddle at the first command. Their weapons, long cavalry lances, were leaned against the walls within arm's reach. Everything was optimized to minimize the time between the signal and the start of the attack. In the confined space of the square, the cavalry lost the ability to maneuver and gather speed over a long distance. Therefore, the strike had to be short, dense, and as devastating as possible to the enemy formation. The horses were to act as living battering rams, pushing apart and overturning the mass of men. The riders were instructed not to engage in individual skirmishes, but to maintain the unit's constant movement. If the cavalry stopped in the crowd, it could lead to a loss of speed and initiative. As they awaited dawn, the cavalrymen mentally rehearsed the sequence of their actions. They understood that the appearance of unknown horsemen would cause uncontrollable panic among the people in the square. This psychological shock was just as important as the physical damage from lances and hooves. The illusion of the horsemen's supernatural origin worked in favor of the small Spanish detachment. They were to emerge suddenly from the darkness of the gate, like demons from the underworld. Pizarro relied on the cavalry as the primary tool for dismantling the enemy's organizational structure. The infantry and artillery created chaos, and the horsemen were to capitalize on that chaos. The speed of the horses left no time for countermeasures or repositioning. 3 detachments were to strike simultaneously from different sides, creating the effect of closing jaws. This synchronization was the key to completely paralyzing the will of the vast crowd. As morning approached, the horses began to show impatience, sensing the approach of the crucial moment. The cavalrymen had to exert considerable effort to keep them in absolute silence. The tension was transmitted from man to animal through the taut reins. It was a time of utmost concentration when any slip-up could ruin hours of preparation. The dark courtyards concealed a force ready to burst forth at the commander's wave of a hand. The hidden cavalry became the ace up the sleeve that was meant to turn the tide of history. The power of the armored horses was compressed within the narrow courtyards, like a taut spring before it is released. Meticulous preparation and sound camouflage ensured that this secret was kept until the very end. Using animals in such unconventional conditions required immense experience and discipline from the entire unit. Do you think the Incas would have been able to put up a fight if they had known about the horses in advance? As morning broke, the view of the valley became clearer and more detailed. Through the dissipating mountain mist, the Spaniards saw the true scale of the army facing them. The Inca camp covered a vast area, and its tents stretched all the way to the horizon. The organization of this camp was striking in its geometric precision and strict military order. Thousands of wisps of smoke from the morning fires rose into the sky, creating a thick veil over the valley. Gradually, the vast mass of people began to move, forming endless columns on the roads. Discipline in the enemy's ranks was impeccable. Each unit took its place without fuss or shouting. This movement resembled the flow of a full-flowing river, which was slowly but inexorably approaching the city. The Incas' weapons glinted in the morning sun, creating the visual effect of an approaching wave of metal. The sheer scale of the event overwhelmed any thoughts of a direct, open confrontation. Spanish observers on the rooftops silently tracked the column's advance, relaying information to the commanders below. A rough estimate of the numbers showed that for every soldier in the ambush, there were several hundred enemy fighters. The math was ruthless and left no room for error in the plan. The realization that a single mistake meant total annihilation made the men grip their sword hilts tighter. The psychological pressure reached its peak during these hours of morning surveillance. The ruler's procession moved with deliberate slowness, demonstrating grandeur and absolute confidence in its power. People walked ahead, clearing the way, followed by detachments in ceremonial attire. The entire spectacle was accompanied by the rhythmic rumble of countless footsteps on the stone slabs of the road. The Spaniards were seeing a ceremony of this magnitude for the first time and were struck by the procession's opulence. Yet, behind this splendor lay a colossal force capable of crushing them in an instant. The vast army halted on the outskirts of Cajamarca, setting up a temporary camp directly in front of the city. Only a portion of this force continued toward the central square, accompanying the ruler. This maneuver indicated that the Incas did not expect serious resistance and felt secure. The division of the enemy's forces played into the Spaniards' hands, reducing the number of people they needed to neutralize. Nevertheless, the ruler's entourage still numbered in the thousands. Inside the buildings of Cajamarca, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Through narrow slits, the soldiers watched as the front ranks of the procession began to fill the triangular plaza. People in brightly colored clothes entered the stone enclosure, unaware of the gun barrels trained on them. The space, which had seemed enormous just an hour ago, was rapidly shrinking under the pressure of the crowd. The density of people in the square increased with every passing minute, creating a perfect target for an attack. The ruler was carried on a luxurious litter adorned with precious metals and feathers of exotic birds. He towered above the crowd, serving as the center of this entire vast and complex human structure. His appearance in the square served as the signal for all Spanish units to be on high alert. The artillerymen stood frozen with smoldering fuses, awaiting the single word that would set the mechanism of destruction in motion. The attention of every man in ambush was focused on the figure on the litter. The noise of thousands of footsteps and voices filled the square, echoing off the high stone walls. This roar drowned out any random sounds the people in their hiding places might make. The Incas felt in control of the situation. Their demeanor was calm and confident. They surveyed the empty buildings, oblivious to the glint of metal in the deep shadows of the doorways. The trap was closing slowly, allowing as many people as possible to enter the kill zone. Francisco Pizarro watched the proceedings from his hiding place, assessing the density of the crowd and its positioning. He waited for the moment when the ruler would be right in the center of the prepared crossfire zone. Timing was critical. An attack too early would scare off the main forces, while one too late could lead to a stampede. The commander's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, ready to give the signal to begin. Time seemed to stand still, concentrated at a single point on the stone plaza. The visual contrast between the handful of people taking cover and the vast mass in the plaza was striking. It was a clash between cunning and absolute overwhelming confidence in their numerical superiority. Wave after wave of Incas entered Cajamarca, filling it just as water fills an empty vessel. Nothing in their behavior betrayed any anxiety or foreboding of the impending catastrophe. The moment of highest tension had arrived, and the spring of the ambush was coiled to its limit. What you have never seen lies hidden in the cold calculation of a single man. Pizarro's logic was based not on the destruction of the enemy's army, but on the paralysis of its command structure. He understood that the Inca Empire had a rigidly centralized structure where all power was concentrated in a single pair of hands. Eliminating or isolating the leader would instantly turn an organized army into an uncontrollable mob. This principle of disarming from above was the only chance for success given such a colossal difference in numbers. The main objective of the entire operation was to capture the ruler alive and unharmed. Eliminating the leader would have provoked the fury of the crowd and the inevitable destruction of the entire Spanish detachment under their onslaught. A living hostage guaranteed safety and provided the most powerful leverage over the entire state system. Therefore, all archers and crossbowmen were strictly forbidden from aiming at the figure on the stretcher. Their task was to create chaos around him, isolating him from his entourage and loyal bodyguards. Pizarro selected a special group of the most experienced fighters, whose task was to break through to the stretcher. This group consisted of heavily armed infantrymen capable of withstanding the colossal pressure of the crowd. They were to move in a wedge formation, cutting through the human mass and clearing a path to the center of the square. Their actions had to be as swift and coordinated as possible, ignoring any threats to their flanks. The success of this group meant the success of the entire campaign, while their failure would lead to immediate collapse. Pizarro's plan was an utterly asymmetrical response to the challenge posed by an army of many thousands. He countered mass with maneuver and traditional tactics with a profound psychological shock. Every element of the ambush, the thunder of the cannons, the speed of the horses, the suddenness of the attack, worked toward this goal. The Spanish commander turned the disadvantages of his position, such as the confined space, into key advantages. He dictated the rules of the game, forcing the enemy to operate under conditions unfamiliar to them. Waiting for the right moment required iron discipline as the crowd in the square grew larger. Pizarro saw that many of his soldiers were on the verge of a nervous breakdown from the mounting tension. He sent calming signals, reminding them of the need to strictly adhere to the planned timing. The commander took full responsibility for the delay, assessing the balance of forces in real time. His mind worked like a precision mechanism, calculating the trajectories of the horsemen and infantry. An assessment of the ruler's entourage's behavior confirmed the correctness of the tactics chosen by the Spaniards. The people in the square were relaxed. Their attention was fixed on the procession, not on the dark buildings. They did not expect an attack in a place they considered completely under control and safe. Pizarro played on this sense of security, allowing the enemy to become deeply ensnared in the trap. He waited for the moment when retreat would become physically impossible for the Incas due to the crush, Duo. The difficulty of the task was compounded by the fact that the ruler was surrounded by hundreds of his most loyal warriors. Breaking through this human wall was incredibly difficult, even with the support of cavalry and artillery. The capture team had to act with surgical precision, separating the leader from his guards. Every step toward the stretcher would require enormous physical effort and continuous work with swords. It was a gamble on brute force, multiplied by the element of surprise of a cavalry charge. In those moments, Pizarro completely cast aside any doubts and focused on the mechanics of the attack. He assessed the distance from the gate to the stretcher, the cavalry's acceleration, and the reloading time of the arquebuses. All these factors came together into a single plan of action, which was to be carried out in a moment. His calculation was cold and pragmatic, devoid of emotion or moral hesitation. The survival of the unit was at stake, and for that, he was prepared to use any means at his disposal. Control of the situation remained in the hands of the Spaniards as long as they remained unseen. The initiative belonged to the ambush party, and Pizarro intended to seize it with maximum speed. He saw that the governor had reached the desired spot in the square, and the time for diplomacy was irrevocably gone. The trap was set, and now all that remained was to release the spring. The commander raised his hand, preparing to give the long-awaited signal to his men, who were exhausted from waiting. Francisco Pizarro's plan was a masterpiece of tactical thinking, based on a precise understanding of the enemy's vulnerabilities. He had turned the Incas' absolute numerical superiority into their greatest weakness in a confined space. The gamble on psychological shock and the isolation of the leader justified all the risks associated with this operation. All the preparation, the sleepless night, and the covert deployment of forces had led to this single moment. Do you think the Inca ruler had a chance to avoid this carefully planned trap? A few hours before dawn, a moment occurred that nearly destroyed Pizarro's entire plan. An Inca advance party, consisting of experienced scouts, approached the central square for a preliminary reconnaissance. At that moment, the nerves of one of the young Spanish soldiers gave way under the strain of hours of tension. He accidentally struck a stone wall with his arquebus, and a hollow metallic clang echoed across the empty square. The scout stopped instantly, peering into the dark openings of the windows of the nearest building. Time stood still for the entire Spanish detachment, holding its breath in the darkness of its hiding places. Pizarro, who was in a neighboring building, gestured for everyone to freeze and take no action. The Inca scouts slowly made their way toward those very doors, behind which a group of crossbowmen stood. The distance was closing, and discovery of the ambush seemed inevitable within the next few seconds. If the scouts raised the alarm, the 80,000-strong army would simply wipe the city off the face of the earth. Inside the building, the crossbowmen slowly and silently raised their weapons, aiming at the approaching silhouettes. The situation had spiraled out of control, and the entire multi-layered plan was crumbling because of a single accident. Pizarro realized that eliminating the scouts now would arouse no less suspicion than their cry. It was a moment of absolute crisis, when the stakes had reached their maximum unbearable limit. The detachment was teetering on the fine line between triumph and complete, unconditional defeat. The Incas had come right up to the doorway. Their faces were just a meter away from the hidden soldiers. The Spaniards could make out the patterns on their fabrics and smell the scent of campfires emanating from their clothing. One of the scouts reached out, preparing to pull aside the cloth covering the entrance to the building. At that moment, the tension inside the room became so thick it seemed palpable. The cavalry in the distant courtyards froze, gripping the reins with hands white with tension. Suddenly, from the direction of the hills, the loud sound of a ritual horn rang out, summoning the people to the ruler. This sharp signal distracted the scouts at the very last, critical second before they were exposed. They turned at the sound, leaving the cloth untouched, and marched quickly back toward the camp. The threat of complete failure receded as suddenly as it had appeared a few minutes earlier. The soldiers in the building slowly lowered their weapons, unable to believe their incredible escape. This incident made it clear to the entire Spanish expedition just how fragile their ingenious plan was. Their confidence gave way to a realization of their profound vulnerability in the face of countless unforeseen circumstances. Pizarro immediately sent messengers to all the buildings with orders to double their vigilance. The incident made the soldiers forget their cold and fatigue, restoring their utmost concentration. The illusion of complete control over the situation dissipated, giving way to cold realism. The crisis revealed a weak link in the plan, the reliance on the flawless behavior of every participant in the ambush. The unit consisted not only of veterans, but also of young men unaccustomed to such pressure. The commanders had to impose strict disciplinary measures, warning of consequences for the slightest sound. An absolute oppressive silence settled over the buildings, broken only by quiet breathing. The psychological atmosphere had changed. The men no longer felt like invincible predators. The turning point of the night forced Pizarro to reevaluate possible retreat routes. He realized that in the event of failure, they would have to fight their way through to a narrow mountain pass. This prospect was extremely difficult, but having a backup plan was essential for coordination. The officers received instructions on the order of retreat in case the trap did not work as intended. This awareness of possible failure gave their resolve a touch of deep realism. The proximity of disaster united the squad more strongly than promises of gold or any sermons. The men realized that their survival depended directly on the person standing shoulder to shoulder with them in the darkness. A single mistake would have cost the other 168 members of the expedition their lives. This mutual responsibility became the reliable glue that held their frayed nerves together until morning. The night entered a new phase, a phase of mobilizing all the body's internal reserves. The moment of near total collapse became the very test of endurance that the unit passed with flying colors. The incident with the scouts served as a harsh wake-up call against overconfidence and complacency. After that episode, the ambush mechanism operated with flawless, absolute precision. Every soldier clearly understood the cost of a mistake in this stone labyrinth of the ancient city. This unseen crisis determined the flawless execution of the maneuver several hours later. When the ruler's procession finally filled the square, the space turned into a sea of bright fabrics and feathers. The Incas moved with dignity, maintaining perfect formation, which spoke to the highest level of discipline. The crowd was so dense that they stood shoulder to shoulder, unable to maneuver quickly. In the center of this living ocean stood a litter, adorned with gold plates that glinted dazzlingly in the sun. The silence of the ancient city gave way to the hum of thousands of voices and the rhythmic sound of ceremonial instruments. Spanish artillerymen aimed the barrels of their falconets at the densest parts of the crowd, awaiting the signal. The archers took aim, trying not to hit the central figure, as Francisco Pizarro had ordered. Cavalrymen in the distant courtyards raised their lances. Their horses nervously shuffled their bandaged hooves over the stones. Every participant in the ambush was in position, ready to fulfill their assigned role. The trap's mechanism was wound to the limit, awaiting only the command to activate. At that moment, Father Vicente de Valverde stepped out onto the square, the only person to leave his hiding place. He held a cross and a breviary in his hands, heading straight for the Inca ruler's litter. This appearance was no accident, but a mandatory formality prescribed by Spanish laws of the time. The priest was to read an official demand for submission to the crown and acceptance of the new laws. His solitary figure in a dark cassock stood in stark contrast to the opulence of the ruler's vast entourage. Valverde's appearance caused confusion among the Incas, as they had not expected to encounter a foreigner here. The ruler looked down at him from the height of his litter with a mixture of interest and haughty contempt. The conversation took place through an interpreter, and its essence was completely incomprehensible and unacceptable to the leader of the empire. The demand to submit to a distant king sounded absurd to a man who held absolute power on the continent. The tension around the litter grew rapidly as the dialogue reached an impasse. The climax came when Valverde handed the ruler the breviary, inviting him to touch the book. The ruler, who had never seen such an object before, turned it over in his hands and tossed it to the ground. The Spaniards took this gesture as a direct insult to their mission and a refusal to negotiate. The priest hurriedly stepped back, shouting words that served as a signal to begin the attack. The diplomatic formality ended in failure, paving the way for the use of military force. At that very moment, Francisco Pizarro signaled to the artillerymen on the roofs of the stone buildings. The long hours of waiting were over, and the coiled spring of the Spanish ambush began to snap open. All the calculations made during the night in the darkness were now to be put to the test in the sun-drenched square. The priest's lone cry was drowned out by the rising roar preceding the first powerful volley. The city froze for a moment before being engulfed by the rapid military chaos. The crowd of Incas remained unaware of what lay hidden behind the dark window openings. They watched the retreating priest, unaware of how quickly the situation would change. Their orderly formation, which had seemed so powerful in the open, proved ineffective here. They had neither the space to maneuver nor the time to regroup their vast forces. The procession's perfect order became the primary factor in their vulnerability during the impending rapid maneuver. The infantrymen inside the buildings prepared to charge, gripping the hilts of their heavy swords and halberds tightly. The assault team formed a wedge right at the doors, ready to clear a path to the stretcher. People's breathing quickened. Adrenaline drowned out all feelings of fatigue after a long, sleepless night. All eyes were fixed on the square, where thousands of people stood frozen in anticipation of the next move. The final second of silence seemed like an eternity before the inevitable showdown began. This clash of two worlds was predetermined by a multitude of factors, but it came down to a single specific point. A collision of worldviews, technologies, and tactics converged on a small stone square high in the mountains. The Spaniards countered numerical superiority with discipline and traditional formations with the cold, mathematical calculation of an ambush. The outcome of that morning was to forever alter the political map of an entire vast continent. Architecture, weaponry, and psychology merged into a single coordinated strike. Dawn brought not relief, but the maximum concentration of all Pizarro's forces. The long night of waiting, preparation, and planning had reached its logical and rapid conclusion. The figure of the ruler in the square became the central axis around which the entire mechanism spun. The immense power of the Inca Empire proved unprepared for the tactics of a confined space. What happened next went down in history as an example of absolute tactical superiority. The roar of the falconets shattered the morning silence, turning the peaceful square into the epicenter of deafening noise. Lead shot struck the ruler's retinue, tearing through the dense ranks of people. In the enclosed stone space, the sound of the shots was amplified many times over, deafening the crowd and sowing primal terror. White gunpowder smoke instantly shrouded the roofs of the buildings, hiding the artillerymen from view below. This first thunderous volley was a shock from which the vast crowd could never recover. Following the artillery, the arquebusiers opened fire, creating a dense wall of sound over the entire square. The enclosed space played its fateful role. The element of surprise was enough to cause confusion. Every loud bang triggered a chain reaction of panic within the tightly packed human mass. The sound of gunfire mingled with the screams of people trying to figure out where the unknown threat was coming from. In a matter of seconds, the organized procession turned into an uncontrollable, chaotically surging crowd. At that moment, the heavy oak doors of the building swung open and Spanish infantry poured into the square. They moved in unison, crashing into the enemy ranks with short lunges and maintaining their pace. The Spaniards' heavy armor made them invulnerable to the Incas' light weapons in close combat. The assault group carved a path straight to the ruler's litter, methodically pushing through the sea of people. Every step the group took was accompanied by immense tension and the clang of metal armor colliding. A trumpet signal gave the command to the cavalry, and swift horsemen burst onto the square from the side courtyards. The appearance of the massive armored animals trampling the formation caused absolute paralysis of will. The horses moved like living machines, slicing the crowd into separate, isolated, and disoriented fragments. The Incas, in confusion, scattered in all directions from the unfamiliar creatures, creating a severe crush. The speed and mass of the cavalry finally shattered any attempts to mount a coordinated resistance in the square. The sounds of war trumpets, the neighing of horses, cannon fire, and screams merged into a single cacophony of chaos. The crush became the Incas' main problem. The rear ranks pressed against the front, preventing them from retreating. The people found themselves trapped in a stone bag that had, until recently, seemed to them a safe ceremonial space. Some tried to climb the stone walls of the plaza in a fit of uncontrollable mass panic. The Spaniards exploited this chaos, continuing to methodically carry out the plan their commander had approved in advance. The ruler's guards showed resilience, forming a tight ring around the stretcher and trying to keep it steady. They braced their shoulders, trying to prevent the stretcher from losing its balance under the pressure of the crowd. When one man could no longer hold his ground, another instantly took his place, demonstrating their loyalty to their leader. This struggle around the litter became the most intense episode of the entire clash in the center of Cajamarca. Francisco Pizarro's group had to exert maximum effort to break through this living wall of defense. Gunpowder smoke settled over the square, reducing visibility and adding to the disorientation of the situation. The Spaniards used the gleam of the golden litter as their guide, which rose above the surging sea of frightened people. The unit's coordination remained flawless. The cavalry cut off the retreat routes, the infantry held the perimeter, and the group advanced toward its objective. They worked like a well-oiled clockwork mechanism, paying no heed to the immense chaos surrounding them. The controlled dynamics of the maneuver suppressed any attempts by the Incas to seize the tactical initiative in the confined space. Pizarro personally led the charge, finding himself right in the thick of the fray at the base of the litter. He knew that time was against them, and that the leader had to be isolated as quickly as possible. Pushing the defenders aside, the Spaniards finally reached the structure holding the ruler high above the crowd. Several sharp jerks at the wooden supports caused the heavy litter to tilt and crash to the ground. The central axis of the Inca Empire's governance had been toppled, and the command structure collapsed along with it. The fall of the litter caused the remaining warriors in the square to lose all discipline. Pizarro grabbed the ruler by his clothes, pushing him away from the main body of the seething crowd. Capturing the leader alive was the primary objective, and it was achieved amid an incredible din. News of the capture spread instantly among the people, turning panic into a general rapid retreat. The vast army outside the city walls, deprived of orders, froze in indecision and deep shock. In a matter of minutes, the balance of power in South America was changed forever thanks to this well-executed maneuver. The reliance on surprise, technology, and architectural features worked with ruthless strategic precision. 168 men were able to break the organization of 80,000 thanks to the right choice of moment. The noise in the square began to gradually subside, giving way to the realization of the radically changed situation. The plan, forged during a sleepless night, ended in a complete triumph of Spanish organizational strategy. When the dust and gunpowder smoke cleared, the full scale of what had happened became apparent to the Spaniards. The plaza of Cajamarca was emptied of the thousands of warriors who had made up the main retinue of the Inca Empire. Those who managed to escape the stone trap hurriedly retreated to the high hills surrounding the city. The vast army, encamped in the valley, began a chaotic retreat, deprived of its ruler's orders. The isolation of a single figure proved sufficient to paralyze the military structure of an entire continent. The Spanish soldiers, breathing heavily, leaned on their weapons, realizing that the active phase of the maneuver was over. The tension of a sleepless night and the colossal expenditure of energy during the attack gave way to severe physical exhaustion. Pizarro immediately ordered the positions to be fortified and all entrances to the empty square to be placed under strict control. They understood that the situation remained unstable and the enemy might attempt to regroup. The captured ruler was quickly transferred to one of the city's most secure inner buildings. The Inca's capture signified more than just a military victory. It was a tectonic shift in the power structure. In an empire with rigid centralization, the absence of a leader led to the immediate collapse of all administrative structures. The governors in the remote provinces did not know how to respond to the situation and preferred to remain in their posts. Pizarro had gained the perfect instrument of influence, allowing him to control vast territories from afar. A small detachment suddenly became a real political force, dictating its terms to a vast empire. The psychological impact of this clash proved stronger than any direct combat in open battle. Rumors of unknown people using roaring trumpets and riding monsters spread rapidly across the country. News of this shock paralyzed the will of many local leaders to mount organized resistance. The Incas were demoralized by the very fact that their infallible ruler had been captured in the very heart of the city. This psychological victory for the Spaniards proved far more significant than their technological superiority on the battlefield. Guarding the captive became the detachment's primary task for all the long months that followed during their stay in Cajamarca. The ruler was kept in isolation, though with the outward trappings of respect for his high status maintained. Through him, Pizarro began issuing orders, forcing the Inca state apparatus to carry out his will. It was a period of strange political coexistence between two centers of power in a single small room. The victors and the vanquished attempted to establish a new system of relations, preparing for the next stage of integration. The tactic of an ambush in a confined space became a classic example of asymmetric planning in the history of military engineering. Francisco Pizarro proved that discipline, coordination, and precise calculation could offset a massive numerical advantage. The use of architecture as a tool of control and psychological shock as a primary factor fully justified itself. This experience was carefully studied by expeditions seeking to establish a foothold in new territories with minimal resources. However, replicating such synchronization under such complex conditions has been extremely rare in history. For the 168 Spanish participants, that sleepless night remained a turning point forever. They accomplished a task that initially seemed impossible thanks to their unity and strict discipline. Their names were recorded in reports to the crown as the men who secured the crown's control over vast and rich lands. They understood that their success was the result of incredibly precise adherence to instructions and cold tactical calculation. Cajamarca became for them a symbol of the utmost concentration of will in a critical situation. The history of the conquest of the Inca Empire is often reduced to a simplified description of the final phase of the capture in the plaza. However, the real key to understanding its effectiveness lies in that long, cold, and tense night of preparation. It was in the silence of the stone buildings, amid the hidden anticipation of the cavalry and the aimed arquebuses, that the final outcome was forged. The pressure, mounting with every passing second, found its outlet in a perfect and mathematically precise maneuver. Cajamarca remains a striking historical example of how structure and calculation trump sheer numbers. What do you think? Was Francisco Pizarro's tactic a stroke of genius or an incredible stroke of luck? Share your opinion in the comments, as the topic of past strategies always sparks lively interest. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new analyses of historical events.